Posse comitatus. You know those old Western television shows where it said we got to form a posse to go after the bad. That's posse comitatus. It's an old kind of common law back in the Middle Ages. It's the power of the county. It's getting the county together to go after bad guys. That's where the term posse comes from. It's posse comitatus. So he's trying to evoke this kind of, lawlessness. We've got to get a posse together to go after lawlessness. In D.C., the president has more power to do so because ultimately the president is the head of the National Guard in the District of Columbia. Yeah. When he wants to go into the states like Chicago, no, the governor is the head of the National Guard. And the way that normally works, except for extraordinary circumstances, is the governor has to request, like there's a big flood or something and you need national help to deal with it. Well, then the governor will make the request or whatnot. So this is the legal basis he's trying to go on. And you got to note, most of these cities he's going after, crime rates are falling. But more importantly, the Republican-controlled major cities, he's not talking about putting the National Guard in with them. It's only the Democratic-controlled cities that he's doing, which really makes this as just a political move and a political stunt and kind of underscores the ugliness of it, not the necessity to fight crime.
The president has used federal Title 32 orders to get us this far. Because this is in Washington, and to your point, he's got a little more leeway here in the federal city with armed National Guard troops. Do the guns make a difference, Robert, or that's just a development that the Secretary of Defense decided to move on?
I think it's just more for show than anything else. It's this continual image that we're tough. Now, what the guns do is you now have people who are not trained in police work. These people, these men and women of National Guards who have done great service for this country in foreign wars in Iraq and Iran, et cetera, Iraq rather, that's what they're trained to do. Now they have guns in a situation where they're not trained. Police get a great deal of training of when they can pull their firearms and when they cannot. And that's because the police serve us, the citizens. Well, now you have people that are trained in a totally different way of using their firearms, walking around a city street with firearms. Frankly, when Donald Trump says he wants to clean up Washington, D.C., I think that's a really bad look for Washington, D.C., because generally speaking, in a democracy, we don't want armed troops all over the place. It's a bad look for democracy. And the chance for something happening is just much greater when you have a bunch of guns with people not trained to use them in this context. They are trained to use their firearms, but not in this context.
We're showing people that view on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube right now, some images taken the night before last when these troops were first deployed with rifles and sidearms. Governor J.B. Pritzker is waiting for something to happen in Chicago. He's telling Trump not to come, not to deploy the troops there. Robert, he made a post on Twitter to Donald Trump and his administration. If you hurt my people, and remember, there are, of course, massive political overtones here for what could be a future presidential candidate. Nothing will stop me, not time or political circumstance, from making sure you face justice under our constitutional rule of law. A political bluster, maybe, but does the governor have any power to keep the troops out of his city?
Well, it's going to be a power to go to courts. You could have if you get to the situation where people are having this militia versus that militia. Well, the last time that really happened was the American Civil War. And I don't think we exactly want to go back to that. Remember, the firing on Fort Sumter in April 1861 was the South Carolina National Guard, essentially, that started the Civil War. So that's kind of what he's invoking. Look, a president can invoke the National Guard for a national interest and to protect a federal building. The best example of that was during the Civil Rights Movement in Little Rock, Arkansas, where President Eisenhower nationalized the National Guard to affect the national interests of civil rights, which was directly under the dictate of the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and ultimately the 15th Amendment, but mostly the 14th Amendment. So there was a direct federal interest and a changing value in this country about the importance of fairness in education and racial equality. That's where we're talking about the National Guard coming in. And Donald Trump just saying, oh, I'm going to fight crime. Well, fighting crime on American streets belongs to mayors and governors who are crying for maybe federal help to have more police officers to hire. That's where you fight crime. More programs. Not sending in the National Guard, which is all a show so the Secretary of Defense can play with a gun. that's where we are.
I've been hearing those calls from governors and mayors as well. Robert, I have to ask you, I never thought I would be asking you about the Federal Reserve, but hey, you're on Bloomberg, so come on in. The water is warm. The president wants to fire a Federal Reserve governor. No one has tried this from the Oval Office before. It's unclear if he has the grounds. She's not been charged with anything. What do you make of this salvo that came from the White House last night?
Well, Joe, okay, I'm going to risk being a little too constitutionally geeky here, so I'll apologize right
Okay, let's do it.
What this really is about is your concept of the presidency of the United States. Donald Trump and his people talk about a strong unitary executive, okay? The Constitution gives all executive power to the president. The president, Article 1, starts with the executive power of the United States will be vested in the president of the United States. But it's always been known to be what's called a weak unitary. So there are checks and balances on the president. He wants somebody to be a commerce secretary or, secretary of state. They got to go get approved by the United States Senate, which is the legislative branch, right? Well, okay, so they created the Federal Reserve Board as an independent agency, and there's been several independent agencies, because presidents have a great interest in making the economy look good while they're president, but they don't care when the other guy has to make the economy look good, who follows him, right? Which can be really terrible for the economy. I mean, Donald Trump wants to make interest rates as low as possible, which might be great to make him look good, but that could be terrible and could cause inflation to increase and cause ultimately employment to go down. So the Fed was created to be independent of that. And the constitutional question is Donald Trump's strong executive theory enough to give him that kind of control over the independent Federal Reserve? Now, economists are horrified at that idea because they want that decision to be independent. And I think the real question for Republicans who want to go after Cook just as an excuse, I think the case looks pretty pretextual against her. But the real question is, if Barack Obama was doing this, would the Republicans like it? Because, you want to give the president all this power. Well, Republicans aren't going to always be in power. At least I hope not. And I hope Democrats aren't always in power because we have a better system when there's balance, right? Well, do you really want to block all these people yelling about Donald Trump should have all this power? They were the same ones saying that somehow Barack Obama was having an imperial presidency because he issued an executive order related to DACA kids. So remember, every constitutional argument, you got to look at sauce for the goose. Sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. And you want to argue your position in the Supreme Court? Well, just think if there's going to be another president there someday who you don't like so much. Do you really want him to have that power, or do you want what the framers intended, which is a constitutional system of checks and balances with a weak unitary executive, not a strong one? So that's the underlying geekiness.
Fascinating. Leave it to Robert McWhirter to be our best guest on the Federal Reserve today. How did I know this was going to happen? So, Robert, she's fighting back. She's got Abbe Lowell. They're going to file suit. Does this go to the Supreme Court?
Oh, very well could be. And here's the issue in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has been this Supreme Court, over the objections of, for instance, Justice Kagan, Sotomayor, and Justice Jackson, have been very accommodating to the president taking over these independent boards. They were created to be independent. Well, in the opinions, the conservative justice says, well, this wouldn't apply to the Fed. And Justice Kagan, in one of her dissents, said, well, why doesn't your reasoning apply to the Fed? This is coming down, if the Supreme Court underscores and upholds the independence of the federal board, which I believe they should, well, then it begs the question, gee, Supreme Court justices, you like the Fed board to be independent because this helps the structure of our economy and the way business works. But when it's Consumer Protection Board, you don't like it. Maybe it's just because you don't like the Consumer Protection Board and you can say Donald Trump can get rid of these people, but we want to protect the Fed from Donald Trump, even Donald Trump. It makes these conservative justices on the court look pretty bad, but they should uphold the independence of this because the world needs an independent central bank for the greatest economy in the world, which still is the United States. And that's why people invest their dollars with their foreign money in U.S. dollars, which strengthens our economy, because we have an independent federal board. And 95% of all economists will tell you exactly what I just said.
Robert, the president is talking to his cabinet as you and I are having this conversation, and producer James is keeping me posted on what's happening in that room. He just suggested the death penalty. We're doing this in real time, so just walk through this with me here. Suggesting the death penalty for murderers in D.C. Here's the quote. If somebody kills somebody in the Capitol, we're going to be seeking the death penalty, and that's a very strong preventative, and everyone that's heard of it agrees with it. Is this something he could do?
Dubious. He would have to have an act of Congress. And I think the best response to that is, well, what about what happened on January 6th with his supporters who killed Capitol police officers? And maybe they should get the death penalty now. Again, let's go with sauce for the goose. You want to start doing that. The death penalty, if you look at it in terms of its efficacy, it doesn't reduce crime. There are too many human behavior connected with crime is far too complicated. People don't usually make that calculus when they're in the middle of a situation where death results or commit the crime of homicide. I have represented many people accused with homicide, and I can tell you none of them all thought that clearly at the time they were committing that act. So this is another tough thing.
Interesting.
And what he's talking about with juveniles and any cash bail are just things that are going to hurt people and not make anybody any safer in the long run.
All right, before you go, Robert McWhirter, you saw they've been setting up checkpoints here in Washington. ICE, it could be another federal agency, Department of Homeland Security, DEA in some cases. We're seeing officers identified. Tell our listeners and viewers what they should do if they run into one of these checkpoints in the District of Columbia.
Well, you got a couple choices. What you have a right to do is say, I don't want to talk to you. I don't have to talk to you. I can tell you my name. If they ask what's your name, you're pretty much required to say that. But you don't have to give in to the statements. Remember, we have the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, which says you not be compelled to incriminate yourself in any way. So you can say, go pound sand. The trouble with that, of course, is if you just want to get to the grocery store, you might not want to spend the next 3 hours messing around with some checkpoint. So you have the right to assert your rights, but there's going to be consequences if you do so. Ultimately, you'll not suffer it, but they can detain you, and that could really make your day a mess, right? So that's where we are. But you got to say something. Why are these DEA agents running around in Washington, D.C. when you have a fentanyl crisis in Arizona and DEA agents are being taken away from protecting America from the flow of fentanyl across the Arizona-Mexico border? It's a total reworking of priorities simply because he wants to try to get his deportation numbers up. And frankly, Biden's numbers are still beating him.
Yeah, that's a very real question. Do I have to roll my window down if I get stopped at a checkpoint? Serious.
What the law says is your information about your name is not constitutionally protected. Do you have to roll your window down? It's probably a good idea because they might do nasty things to you if you don't.
Okay.
There's constitutional rights, and then there's if you really want to, go ahead and get eggs and milk at the grocery store, right? But that being said, you have no constitutional obligation to incriminate yourself anyway, and you don't need to answer that question, are you a citizen? But of course, like I said, if you want to get to the grocery store, a lot of people just say, yeah, I'm a citizen, bye.